Before independence came colonization, and before colonization came conquest. In the late 19th century, European powers carved up Africa at the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85. No African leaders were present. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and others staked claims over vast territories, drawing borders with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. The goal: exploitation. Africa was seen as a treasure chest of raw materials: rubber, gold, diamonds, cocoa, copper, palm oil. Europeans came with railroads, rifles, and religion, extracting wealth while enforcing brutal control. The Congo Free State under King Leopold II became one of the most horrific examples, where millions perished under forced labor and mutilation. Across the continent, indigenous economies were dismantled and replaced with extractive colonial systems. By the early 20th century, nearly 90% of Africa was under European rule. The continent had been divided, subdued, and stripped for imperial profit. This frenzied race for Africa's riches set the stage for global conflict. European rivalries intensified as empires expanded. Tensions over colonies, alliances, and national pride exploded into World War I, a catastrophic war rooted in imperial competition. The devastation of World War I destabilized Europe, creating the fertile ground for the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler. The Second World War followed, shattering Europe's infrastructure and draining its empires. In the aftermath, colonial powers could no longer afford to hold their overseas territories. The age of empires began to collapse. The winds of change were sweeping the globe. After World War II, the colonial world began to unravel. In Asia, nations like India and Indonesia broke free from European empires. In Africa, the same fire was burning. Freedom did not come easy. In Algeria, a brutal 8-year war against French rule claimed over 1 million lives. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising challenged British domination. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, liberation movements waged long guerrilla wars against Portuguese forces. These were not peaceful transitions. They were battles for the very soul of Africa. With every passing year, more African nations gained independence. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Congo, Kenya, Zambia, Senegal, Tanzania. The dominoes began to fall, but as European flags came down, new powers stepped in. The 1950s and 60s were a time of awakening. Across the continent, African nations were breaking the chains of colonial rule. Flags were raised, anthems were sung, and proud new leaders emerged to usher in an era of freedom. Kwame Nkrumah preached Pan-African unity. Julius Nyerere spoke of Ujamaa, African socialism. Patrice Lumumba dreamed of a Congo free from foreign domination. For the first time in centuries, Africa had its voice, but freedom, it turned out, was only the beginning of a new kind of war. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle for dominance. Both claimed to support liberation and democracy, but in reality, they sought influence and control. They didn't want African unity, they wanted allies. Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first prime minister, was a symbol of African independence and Pan-African pride, but his refusal to align with the West made him a threat. In 1961, he was assassinated. With the complicity of Belgium and the CIA, he was replaced by Joseph Mobutu, a US-backed dictator who ruled with an iron fist for decades. Angola became one of the Cold War's bloodiest fronts. The US supported UNITA, while the Soviets and Cuba backed the MPLA. Mozambique, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Congo all became ideological battlegrounds. Coups, weapons, and covert operations turned hopeful nations into war zones. The flags had changed, but the games of empire had not. The 1970s brought hope for development. African nations borrowed heavily from global lenders to build infrastructure, expand services, and modernize economies. Then came the 1980s. Global interest rates soared. Oil prices crashed. Debt spiraled out of control. Enter the IMF and World Bank. Their solution: structural adjustment programs. These required African governments to slash spending, remove subsidies, devalue currencies, and privatize state industries. But SAPs were not just economic fixes, they were geopolitical tools. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, African nations were pushed deeper into alignment with Western capitalist systems. The West saw these policies as an opportunity to gain strategic control over the economies of newly independent states. The privatization component was particularly devastating. Public assets, national airlines, water utilities, energy providers, railroads, were sold at rock-bottom prices, often to foreign corporations or elite allies. This was not development, it was a fire sale. The result, African economies shrank, inequality deepened, and domestic industries collapsed under foreign competition. Hospitals closed, teachers were fired, food prices soared, public transit collapsed, not by force of arms, but by signature and spreadsheet. As African nations struggled under debt, foreign corporations seized the opportunity. In Nigeria, Shell controlled the oil fields and left behind pollution and poverty. In Congo, foreign firms extracted cobalt and coltan for global tech companies. In West Africa, the CFA franc kept entire nations economically tethered to France. Military bases remained, French troops in the Sahel, US drones in the Horn of Africa, British trainers in former colonies. Dictators like Mobutu in Zaire or Oyadema in Togo thrived with Western backing. Aid was given, but democracy was optional. What mattered most was loyalty and access. The colonizers had changed uniforms, from soldiers to CEOs. In the post-colonial period, many African nations collapsed into civil war. The Cold War powers armed both sides, caring little for the consequences. In Liberia, Charles Taylor's war for power unleashed a brutal conflict fueled by blood diamonds and foreign arms. In Sierra Leone, warlords used child soldiers and carried out campaigns of terror and amputation. Millions suffered. Infrastructure crumbled. Generations were lost. In 1994, Rwanda, long manipulated by colonial powers, exploded into genocide. Over 800,000 people were slaughtered in just 100 days. The international community largely stood by. No African conflict was as vast and deadly as the Congo Wars. What started as a civil war in Zaire, later renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, quickly escalated into a regional war, drawing in 9 African nations and multiple armed factions. It became Africa's deadliest conflict since World War II. With the fall of dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, a new government rose under Laurent Kabila, but peace was short-lived. Congo's vast mineral wealth, diamonds, gold, and coltan, became both the cause and the fuel for war. Rebel groups, neighboring countries, and international corporations all sought control over the riches buried beneath Congolese soil, and the people paid the ultimate price. More than 5 million people lost their lives. Entire communities were displaced. The war would rage on for years, with only brief pauses for fragile peace agreements that rarely held. In Sudan, civil war raged for decades, dividing the country along ethnic and religious lines. South Sudan would later gain independence, but conflict would continue, leaving millions displaced. The scars of genocide and ethnic violence remain fresh in Africa's history, a painful reminder of the dangers of division and unchecked power. Many of these conflicts were rooted in colonial-era divisions, borders drawn without regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. These divisions became the spark. Foreign interests provided the fuel. Wars funded from abroad, waged with local lives over stolen futures. The Cold War turned Africa into a battleground. The United States and the Soviet Union saw the continent not as a land of liberation, but as a strategic chessboard for global dominance. With foreign governments propping up dictators and funding armed groups, Africa's struggle for true independence was far from over. From the assassination of Patrice Lumumba to the rise of oppressive regimes, Africa was often trapped in a cycle of external manipulation and internal conflict. The Ethiopian Civil War was one of Africa's longest and bloodiest conflicts, lasting from 1974 to 1991. It began when Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a military coup, leading to the rise of the Derg. The war was not just a battle for political power, it was a struggle over identity, land, and the future of Ethiopia itself. The Derg's policies led to famine, mass displacement, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. By the early 2000s, war fatigue, diplomatic efforts, and economic shifts led many African nations toward peace agreements and reconstruction. The African Union, replacing the weaker Organization of African Unity, played a key role in securing peace, supporting mediation efforts, and sending peacekeeping forces into conflict zones. In Rwanda, reconciliation efforts helped heal a nation torn apart by genocide. In Angola and Liberia, long civil wars finally came to an end, allowing the slow process of rebuilding to begin. Many African nations transitioned from military rule to democratic governance, shifting the focus from survival to economic growth and development. While the ghosts of war still haunt parts of the continent, Africa has taken steps toward lasting peace. The wounds of the past are deep, but the determination to forge a new future is stronger than ever. The scars of war remain, but Africa is moving forward. Across the continent, a new generation is stepping up, demanding accountability, stability, and economic prosperity. Africa has entered an era of opportunity, where growth and innovation are replacing the destruction of the past. But the lessons of history must not be forgotten, because the price of instability has already been paid in blood. Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.